All right, how does everybody feel? A little tired? So let's all stand up now, get some energy. Stand up, stand up. It's one of the last sessions for the conference, so you should enjoy them. Raise your hands up. Pretend to grab some apples from a tree. I stole it from Supermarine at Ennis, Spain, and people really like that. Okay, turn around, look at your neighbors. All right, sit down again. Oh, these lights. All right, so again, raise your hand. Who of you in this room uses open source projects at work? That's the whole room, nice. So raise your hand again. Who of you submitted issues or pull requests to open source projects? Raise your hand again. Oh, that's almost everyone again. And then who of you runs their own open source project or is one of the maintainers? Raise your hand again. Cool, it's like 20%. Nice. So almost everyone in this room interacts with open source projects in some way. So I hope my talk is going to be useful. Just a little background about me. I'm Felix. I'm the creator of Fastlane, this small little tool that allows you to automate the App Store deployment for iOS and Android apps. And today I don't want to talk about Fastlane at all. We already had a really cool workshop yesterday. But I want to talk about open source projects and how you can scale them up to make them available for more users. So I was lucky enough with Fastlane to grow this small side project of mine I started during college to a project that is now part of Google with 13,000 commits and 18,000 stars on GitHub. And Fastlane is actively being developed by 600 external contributors, and many of the contributors are in this room, and some of them even core contributors, so that's really cool. And I started this project during college as a side project. And then the first companies started reaching out, and I decided to join Twitter like 2 years ago. And after being at Twitter for 1.5 years, I'm now part of Google, and I work on Fastlane full-time. So in this talk, I want to share a little bit about what I learned when scaling the project from 0 to tens of thousands of active users. So in general, you can categorize open source projects into 4 stages. So stage 1 is when you build like a small little library or a tool and you put the code on GitHub. And it doesn't mean that anybody's using the source code yet, right? You just have it on GitHub. And I looked into a list of all the GitHub projects and I scrolled through them and I saw that 40% of the GitHub projects have 0 stars and no interactions and no issues on GitHub. The second stage is when developers start using your project. And this is already a really cool feeling because you just put out some code on GitHub and some strangers on the internet trust your code and they start using it. And you might realize that they start using it when you receive your first issues or pull requests, because that's when people actually care about your project. Finally, stage 3 is when people start, when your project becomes the go-to solution in its field. So great examples are CocoaPods and Fastlane. So you might realize that the first time when you see tweets of people recommending your software. So somebody would tweet, oh, stupid provisioning profiles and code signing, and then people would jump in and say, like, hey, have you thought about using Fastlane? Again, that's a really cool stage also to be in. And then there is the next stage, which is not as cool, hyperscale projects. So great examples for hyperscale is things like Swift or React Native. So you have thousands of GitHub notifications every day. And it's going to be really, really hard to actually monitor those things and still have like a personal touch. So I was lucky enough to go through all those stages with Fastlane. I started on the first stage and now it's stage 3. And I learned a lot over the last 2 years, but not so much about like coding or design patterns, but more about the human factor of open source software. Like how to best interact with people on GitHub. How to enable contributors to have the highest impact, and how to handle support for large-scale open source projects. So in the first section of this talk, I want to quickly talk about what challenges you will face as your project grows. And the second part of the presentation will be about solutions you can apply to your own project. So let's start with the project momentum. The bigger your project becomes, the harder it is to keep the innovation you had in the beginning. Because suddenly you have to consider all these different use cases. You have to consider thousands of production setups. So you cannot just change a default value or remove an option you previously had. And another big part of this is, of course, handling support. Because once you pass a few active thousands of users, you will notice that helping users will take more time than actually working on the project. So this graph here shows that I spent twice as much time on GitHub last year than I spent in my text editor. And you also see Xcode at the very bottom. And so people submit all kinds of issues, and most of them aren't actually issues, but many of them are questions on how to use the software or feature requests. So you have to find the best way to handle and receive feature requests. So either you could say, oh, I'm just going to use GitHub issues and add a label for that and have the discussion there. You could also have a separate website where people can submit ideas and comment on them or upvote them and so on. Or you can even feature freeze your project, meaning you don't accept any new features at all. So in general, all the features you're accepting have to align with your vision. So you as a maintainer should have a way to close them if you don't agree with them. So why is that important? Well, very often with Fastlane, the following happened. We would get an issue that says, well, I'm really tired in the morning. Fastlane should make the coffee in the morning so that, yeah, I can just grab it and drink it. And then I would come ahead and would say, like, sorry, this doesn't fit into the Fastlane vision. Like, we don't want to implement this right now, and I'm going to close the issue. Can you guess what happens next? Why did this get closed? It's not implemented yet. It's not fixed yet. So again, it's very important that you have a shared understanding with your users on what kind of features you're looking for your project. And very similarly to features, you have to decide what pull requests to merge and which to reject. Because once a change is merged into your code base, you have to support and test it in all future releases. And if the feature breaks in the future, very often you will be the one who has to fix it. So in general, reviewing and testing pull requests takes almost as much time as writing the code for it. So yeah, don't be sad if a project, an open source project, doesn't respond to your pull request or even rejects it. There is good reasons behind that. And another interesting phenomenon we had that you can see with some big open source projects, including Fastlane, is when the project maintainer stops being a user of the project. So the reason this happens is because the project was started because the author built this project for themselves, right? So they wanted to make their life easier. So suddenly they work full-time on these open source projects, and with that, stopping the activity they've been doing before. So the challenge is to still somehow use your software so that you can realize how to best spend your time. So for example, Fastlane is still deployed using Fastlane, so therefore everybody contributing to Fastlane also uses the project. And if it's not possible for your project, at least try to like onboard from time to time and see if there's any rough edges or anything you need to fix. So this is actually really important, and as you've seen, like I don't spend a lot of time on Xcode, but I still try to write side project apps from time to time and publish them to the App Store. Then there's a big information imbalance between the project maintainers and the users. Because for you as a maintainer, an issue is just another issue. But for the user, this one issue is everything. So this issue is 100% of the interaction they have with your project. And it's something they will remember for a really long time. And this first hit me when I attended WWDC last year, and iOS developers came up to me and asked me very specific questions around a very specific GitHub issue we talked about like a year ago, and they assumed that I would remember the exact context. So for you as a maintainer, it's an issue that has to be prioritized, and it might not be the most important thing right now. But for the user, this issue is everything, and it might keep them from using your project. So now to the more interesting part of the presentation, on how to scale open source projects. And with Fastlane, we've tried many approaches on keeping the GitHub project healthy. But we're still learning and experimenting a lot. But we found some really good solutions for some of the problems we have. So I want to share some of the best things we discovered that you can apply to your own project as well. So first off, improve your error messages. Because no matter how good your source code, how good your project actually is, you will always have bugs and crashes. So the way you show those messages is actually really, really important. I'm going to show you two exact same error messages. However, they're shown differently by Fastlane. So, as you can see, something went wrong when creating a new app on the Apple Developer Portal. But it's very hard to see the actual error message on what's happening. So if you look very closely, you would actually see that it's something about the app name using invalid characters. So we thought about how can we simplify that. And we came up with this. It's very similar to what CocoaPods does also. We're going to show the error message in red, so it's very clear on what the error message is, while still having a way to get the full output of the stack trace, environment variables, and so on. So additionally, we went further with Fastlane. As part of this error message, we will show links to documentation or Stack Overflow replies. We will show you commands that will tell you how to reproduce a problem. And finally, show you all the relevant information you will need to debug the issue, like a certificate ID or team ID. So once you have created error messages, the next step is to make it as easy as possible to find similar existing issues. So when you receive a cryptic error message, what's the first thing you usually do? You would search on GitHub or on Google, right? So you as a project maintainer should make it as easy as possible for the user to do so. Ideally, the discussion happens right where the error happens. So with Fastlane, when Fastlane crashes, it would show a dialog that looks like this. It's going to use the GitHub API to find similar issues and show them right in your terminal. And if the user doesn't find any existing issues that match the issue they have, they will probably submit an issue on GitHub. So it is very important that you properly manage GitHub issues. And I'm not a big fan of bots and automated messages. However, as soon as you reach a certain scale, you will need some kind of automated systems to reduce the support load. So in this section, I want to show you some of the main use cases of bots in open source projects and how you can use them. So all the bots, just like everything we do with Fastlane, is also open source on GitHub under the MIT license. So providing all information when submitting a bug report is really, really difficult, even for us as software engineers. So GitHub recently introduced the issue template.md file that autofills the new issue form with like a given text. However, most people would completely ignore the instructions. So we have these two little checkboxes on like, have you updated to the most recent release? And have you read the contribution guideline? As part of the contribution guideline, we tell people to add a key emoji as part of their pull request issue. And in total, we received around 5 keys, I think. So people lie when they click this box. So basically, using the Fastlane bot, we will ensure that all the information we need is available. And if not, we will tell them, well, you have to run Fastlane env. Because we want to make it easy for people to provide the information we need. Because we don't expect iOS developers to know how to find out what Ruby version they're running or what OpenSSL version is bundled as part of their Ruby. So we provide a Fastlane env command similar to what CocoaPods does. And as an output, it looks like this. It's like a really nice markdown code that will make it easy for people to share the complete setup. So if you receive similar issues very often, you should always step back on fixing the underlying issue, right? Because if 10 users submit a specific kind of issue, there are hundreds of other people that have the same error but didn't take the time to submit an issue. So in the case of Fastlane, a lot of problems are related to code signing. But for us, as an external team, there is no way to actually fix code signing. Only Apple can do that. So we wrote an extensive guide on how to set up code signing and how to troubleshoot it. But turns out most people don't actually like reading documentation. Surprise. So we have a Fastlane bot that will actually point them to the documentation for code signing if it looks like the issue is related to code signing. So some of you might already had some interactions with this bot. So stale issues. The key to handle support for large-scale open source projects is to keep issues moving. Try to avoid having issues stall. Because we all as iOS developers know how frustrating it can be to submit a radar to Apple and then not hear back for like 2 or 3 years. And then once after 2 or 3 years, all you get back is like, hey, can you try this with Xcode 12? So chances are high you have no way of reproducing it. And in particular, I guess if you're using Swift, you would have to migrate like 4 versions to actually be able to compile. So it's the same problem for open source projects, right? Because the user might have already found a different solution and doesn't actually care about fixing it anymore. The user might have found a workaround and doesn't want to spend time anymore. Or, very likely also, the user just switched companies or team, right? They don't even have access to the source code anymore. So having a bot can ensure that all issues are still relevant and reproducible. So for Fastlane, when an issue has no activity for the last 2 months, the Fastlane bot will ask if the issue is still relevant with the most recent Fastlane release. And if no one replies to that bot, the issue gets auto-closed. So it will also tell the user that they can always submit a new issue referencing the old one. And about a month after closing that issue, we will even log the conversation so that no one can comment on it anymore. And this is actually really important, and it brings me to the next topic on why you should log old issues. Because by logging old inactive issues, you can avoid resurfacing GitHub issues from previous releases. So for example, users would comment on old issues where people already found a solution, and it might not even be related at all. And if they do that, they will trigger a lot of emails to all these people who already found a fix. And of course, the very famous "Me Too" comments that just send out emails but don't add any actual value to the conversation. So by telling users to submit a new issue, you properly go through the complete lifecycle of an issue again. First, the user submits an issue on GitHub. The bot will ensure that all the information is available for you to debug the issue. Finally, the actual discussion around the problem happens, and then the issue either gets resolved or it gets auto-closed by the bot. So how much did all these bots actually help for the Fastlane project? Well, by introducing those things, we reduced the number of open PRs and issues dramatically. We went from 700 open issues to less than 300, and we stayed there for the last year. And until now, we mostly covered issues, but a very essential part is, of course, also responding to pull requests. So your continuous integration system will verify that all the tests pass and that the code style follows your conventions. And they don't ensure the way how changes are introduced. That's why Orta and I set out to build Danger, which I was very happy to see was being covered by a few other sessions at this conference. So I don't need to explain what Danger is anymore, but I want to explain one specific use case we use it for Fastlane. It can help with PR and runs. This is a word I invented. And so you see that in many open source projects. Someone takes the time to submit a pull request, and then the tests fail. And the author doesn't update the tests, like they don't fix the tests. So you as a project maintainer now have to go ahead and tell them to fix the tests. And the reason why that's the case is because GitHub doesn't send out a notification when the tests of their PR fails. So this is something you can easily automate with Danger. You just pass the test results, you post the test results on GitHub, triggering an email notification for the user, and therefore they're going to fix the tests, hopefully, sometimes. So in general, not only for open source project, it is very important that you work towards the same direction. And it's a little harder for open source projects because the communication happens asynchronously, right? So some projects have a vision.md document that describes the bigger vision of the project and where it should be heading. So as your user base grows, you want more people joining you on maintaining the project and pushing it forward. You want to increase the buzz factor as your project grows, meaning more and more people have push access to the repo and are familiar with the code base. And of course, with a growing community, you also need to ensure that developers are in a safe environment. So one action you should take very early on, and it doesn't take too much time, is to add a code of conduct. And you should make it easy for people to get started contributing, because if you don't have a monorepo, it's going to be really hard for people to set it up, right? So CocoaBots has this repo called Rainforest, for example. I personally recommend monorepos. Finally, this is something many open source projects don't consider. The more complex your software architecture is, the more difficult it is for people to get started coding and less people are able to contribute. So instead of using the latest Swift magic to save 3 lines of code, use the easiest to understand approach to solve a problem, making it easier for people to spot issues and contribute to your project. And this goes without saying, to grow the community around your project, always be as friendly and welcoming as you can. Thank people for submitting issues and PRs, and ask people for help and clarification if needed. Finally, when scaling your open source project, you have to say no to a lot of things. To enable your project to still grow, you can implement different ways for users to extend your software. So one thing you can do is implement a domain-specific language. And many Ruby-based open source projects do that, like CocoaPods, Bundler, and Fastlane. So instead of having static values, like it is the case for JSON or YAML files, you can actually execute code in a pod file or a fast file. So this is extremely useful to fetch or generate values on demand, like accessing an internal server. Here is an example Ruby DSL that allows users to pass static values, closures, or even call external methods and web services. The next step is to allow people to extend your project without actually having to touch the code base. So for Fastlane, when a user needs an integration with a third-party service that isn't available yet, you can easily build your own local action. And allowing local action works great for a while until people want to share the extension with the world. And that's, of course, when the next cool thing comes into play called plugins. And while it's not always possible for all kinds of projects to implement the plugin system, it will enable your software to enable at a much faster pace. So your dependency graph will stay slimmer, your code base will be smaller, and you might receive less pull requests you have to review. And most platforms already have a great dependency manager available. So don't reinvent the wheel. Make use of whatever's available for the platform you're developing for. So at Fastlane, for example, we use RubyGems. And within just a year, we have about 200 external third-party plugins available. So scaling open source projects is really hard. And there is a lot of challenges you will face while scaling up. But ideally, you're not the only person having to solve all these problems that are caused by a growing project, but you have contributors helping you. If you face challenges, don't give up. Ask the community for help. Without the amazing Fastlane community, the project would never be where it is now. Good open source projects stay alive for a really, really long time, and you can have an enormous impact on developers and companies around the world. And even if maintaining open source projects can be really hard sometimes, there is nothing more rewarding than seeing how your software is being used by fellow developers. And if you have any other ideas on how to make open source projects better for both sides, please come say hi. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So Felix, thing for you. So since Fastlane 2.15.57.2, there is a provisioning profile which doesn't work anymore, so I can't sign anymore with this.
Maybe you can take that off topic.
Come on, he's here.
Okay, maybe the crowd is not interested. Come on. Thank you for this talk. Sorry for that. What would you implement first? What should you do first among all those nice devices? It seems that, I mean, for some of them, it's a lot of work. So what would you do first?
What would I do first if a project becomes bigger?
Yeah.
Well, first thing, I wouldn't do anything before it's not necessary. Before it's necessary. So very often it's okay to have a plain GitHub project. I would probably add a code of conduct pretty early on. That's an easy step that helps a lot of people. And then do things as necessary. So once you realize that you spend every weekend on GitHub going through the notification, then it's probably time to have some kind of bots maybe or something like this.
And apart from bots, the crowd asked us, how do you handle all the notifications from GitHub? It's like they are sending notifications for a lot of things. Like, do you have maybe some tooling or some ideas and some experience?
I wish, yeah. My landing page is github.com/notifications. That's where I spend most of my time. There is this one software called Octabox, or OctaKit or something, It's like a third-party GitHub notifications client.
Oh.
I don't use that personally. I just use GitHub notifications. We recently started having on-call rotation in our team, so everybody's responsible for support for 1 week. So that means I'm responsible for support 1 week per month. But previously I was doing a lot of the work. And it's really hard because on weekends you get less notifications, but still you get notifications because people work on weekends also. So it's really hard to have some downtime also because I always feel bad when I don't reply in time.
Yeah,
It's
sure.
the same idea as Egor yesterday. You have like a calendar saying like those days, this guy is going to be in charge of the...
Yeah, basically. And we started doing that only a few months ago. Before that, it was everybody was jumping in, and I ended up spending far too much time on GitHub.
Yeah.
About weekends, so how do you manage work-life balance? I mean, I guess when you receive notifications, even during weekends, you like to reply or maybe even not, and because you are fed up with that.
Yeah, I tend to be too much on GitHub, so I would, because again, like I always feel bad when I don't respond in time, and it is literally impossible to read through every GitHub issue. It's too many. And that's a good sign. Like GitHub issue sounds negative. I think they should rename it because a lot of them, as mentioned, are feature requests or questions. So a lot of them are actually like, oh, I have this very custom setup, and how can I use Fastlane to make use of that? And so these are all things that are actually not issues, right? So I always try to help as much as I can, but still trying to not go on GitHub after, let's say, 6 p.m. or something. But I only started doing that recently. Before that, I was on GitHub all the time.
I guess so.
Yeah.
And to come back a bit about the bots, can you tell us more about how you implement those bots?
Yeah, the bots
is it
are
hard?
really stupid and simple, actually. People are like, oh, what artificial intelligence are you using or something. It's really simple. It's a Ruby script of like 200 lines of code. All it does, it runs like multiple times a day, I think once an hour. And it would go through new notifications and then parse the body of the issue or the pull request and then add labels or comment. And one thing recently added just last week, we deployed a new version of Fastlane that broke a feature of Deliver. And we deployed it in the evening, not a smart idea, and then didn't monitor the incoming notifications. And so we missed the regression we shipped. And so what we do now is we already recommend people to use the word regression in the title. So we know we want to fix regressions as soon as possible because fixing regressions is more important than supporting some very weird custom setup from one person, right? So we now have a bot that would detect regressions, hopefully, and then post it in our Slack group so that we can react faster.
And
Yeah. So how do you find? I mean, how do you automate automation? How do you automate Fastlane? Do you have there are, I guess, lots of tests, but I guess they can't cover all the possible use cases and issues.
So I think with Fastlane we have, I don't know the number, but many thousands of tests. The problem is that you cannot test everything. So for example, if there is Xcode Gold Master shipped and it changed the way Xcode build list API works, like these are not things we can catch, right, in an automatic fashion. So we always depend on people telling us on Twitter and on GitHub if something broke.
And what do you think of this approach, which is slightly different from yours, I think, that is used at RX Swift? They actually split the projects in 2 parts. Like you have the core of RX Swift, and you have some communities, repositories that are actually managed by some other people. Like, did you imagine doing that on Fastlane, like splitting? You have a lot of tools, so
I really like that. So as many of you probably know, Fastlane didn't used to be a monorepo. It was 20 repos. So it was easier because we could say, oh, this person is responsible for snapshot and this person is responsible for frame it. With the monorepo, it's a little more complicated. So we just have this one big thing. With plugins, it's a little better because we say, well, the plugins are owned by the community, so we can focus on making the core better. So that's one thing, but another thing we've been thinking about is that we don't have a lot of knowledge on Android, for example. So we've been thinking about granting more admin level things to people who have more experience with Android. Similarly also for Mac OS. So Fastlane kind of supports Mac, but not really, like not all the tools. because we just don't have enough Mac experience. So we just haven't defined yet on how this might look like, but we're probably going to do that at one point.
Oh, okay. Just to come back about this code that you're using for the bot, is it something that is also open source that we can find that is easily reusable for other projects?
It is open source. It's on a Fastlane org. The repo's name is issue-bot. It's really a simple Ruby script, so you can either fork it and run it yourself. Actually, I was always hoping that we would upgrade Danger to be at the point that it would also handle issues, because that would be really nice. So it is more like a hack to have one big file that has all these rules. But yeah, feel free to take a look. It's a very simple Ruby script, or you can write it very easily also in Swift if you prefer that, and run it on a server. There is some really cool GitHub API clients for Swift as well.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.